Hello, my name is Waylon Lewis, and every week we'll bring you a new podcast with Elephant Journal.
Hello, friends. This is Waylon Lewis of Elephant, obviously, and I'm here today with Sir Dougald Hine. He has a wonderful, eloquent accent, and he's just music to poetry to listen to. We're going to talk about everyone's favorite subject in the entire world, which I won't let you know what it is yet. We're going to wait for him to join. All right, good sir. How are you?
Hello, I think, yeah, this is cool.
So, Dougald, tell me, do you have your book on you? I should have asked.
Yeah, sure. Here it is.
But you're so organized. Good man. At work
Yeah.
in the ruins. So what's that extremely long subtitle? What does that say?
Finding our place in the time of science, climate change, pandemics, and all the other emergencies.
So basically you sat down a couple years ago, I imagine, you said, I want to write a easy book, like on a, just a small finite subject, just tackle some of the easy stuff, right?
Yeah, that is pretty much the logic behind it. Now, while I was writing the first draft of it, it was actually called Why I'm No Longer Talking to People About Climate Change.
Why you're no longer what?
Talking to people about climate change.
And so what did you mean by that initial title?
Well, essentially, there are some obvious reasons why that didn't end up being the title for the book, but I have spent a lot of my adult life in one form or another talking to people about climate change. And I've never been the guy whose job it is to stand up there with the charts and explain the science of it and all of that, which is a really important role. But I kind of come in where that part of the work runs out, right? When we get into the question of what does it mean? How are we changed by this knowledge? What would it take for us to absorb this in a way that looked like taking it seriously rather than looked like assuming it was a problem that could be fixed and made to go away? And
so like I imagine like Inconvenient Truth. We all watched that documentary, or many of us did. Half of us reacted with, taking it seriously, fear, optimism, wondering what we can do about it, doing one little takeaway, like bringing our own container or biking more or whatever. And then maybe another healthy percentage or unhealthy percentage said, this is all BS because it's Al Gore. To hell with this, it's all conspiracy, or I don't care about it. And you would come in at that point with people having different reactions to it: optimism, nihilism, not believing.
Well, I guess my recollection of An Inconvenient Truth is it was basically like Al Gore kind of walked you up to a viewing platform about a quarter of a mile away from the edge of the abyss and kind of pointed in that general direction.
Yeah.
And then presented you with a list of things where if we do these things, then all the bad stuff will go away, and sort of walked you back down safely. And that was sort of part of the legacy of that era of how we tried talking to people about climate change, was we needed to make it safe enough that we didn't panic people, but there was a kind of gap, a sort of distance between what people were saying when they walked out on stage and what the same speaker would say if you caught them quietly over a glass of whiskey at, I don't know what time it is with you. It's after 11 o'clock at night here in Sweden. So at this sort of stage,
it's always the dark midnight of the soul here in Boulder, in my home, where I do take climate change seriously. So I think, I do thousands of interviews. If this conversation can make me think a little bit differently about climate crisis, I'll be incredibly grateful. I don't know what that would mean, how I would think differently, but I have had conversations, like you say, after the conversation off camera with, I've interviewed Bill McKibben and many, many climate experts, and Lester Brown, many, and most, I would say 100% of them are more, doomsday about it off camera.
Right. So that was kind of where I came into this, was that I became one of the people who was willing to say some of the things while the microphone was running that other people only said once the microphone was switched off. But it came out of a sense that actually it does us no good to, and you'll know this, Waylon, it does us no good to have a gap between, what we experience as true as best we can based on what we know in our hearts and what we stand up on a stage and say to people. And I think the fact that I was a writer and had spent a lot of my life working with artists played a role in this, because when you're a politician or a campaigner or a communications person, you can have a set of calculations that go into choosing the message that you deliver when you go on stage. When I've worked a lot with theater people and with stand-up comedians, and when you go on stage, if there is a gap, if there's something that doesn't ring true to you, then the whole act dies. So in some ways, I think, like me and Paul Kingsnorth, who started the Dark Mountain Project together, we were kind of like canaries in the mine because we were artists, because we came from a background where you can't get away with having a gap between your public thing you're saying and what you secretly think.
But, I'm interested in politics. I may be running for some local office here. And if I get up on stage and I say, we're already at least 10 years over, the deadline for meaningful change. Yes, there's a lot we can still save. There's a lot we can change, but we're in for it. And it's going to be, and in some ways it already is, but it's going to be epically awful. Then what?
Well, so there's sort of two bits to it, really. You can look backwards. You can go, how did we find ourselves in this trouble?
Mm-hmm.
And there's a whole conversation that needs to be had there, which is part of what I'm writing about in the book.
Okay.
Because, very often what happens is we talk about climate change, and understandably, because the conversation starts within science, it gets kind of stuck inside a box of the bits of the story that science can help us with. But a basic question like, how did we find ourselves here, actually already takes us beyond the limits of the part of the story that the scientists can take responsibility for. Because it boils down to a question of, are we in this trouble as a result of a piece of bad luck with the atmospheric chemistry? That it turns out, like 7 generations into the Industrial Revolution, that all of that carbon dioxide we were throwing out was destabilizing the atmospheric chemistry and the Holocene settlement that we had been living within for a few thousand years? Or are we in this trouble as the result of a way of approaching the world, a way of seeing and treating everything and everyone that would always have brought us to this kind of a pass, even if the atmospheric chemistry had been different? Like, those are two very different ways of making sense of what's going on. They have different consequences, because if it's a piece of bad luck with the atmospheric chemistry, what we're looking for is a set of fixes that will allow us to keep on track with the way that things were going and just fix this climate bit. But if the reason we're in this trouble is a way of approaching the world, a way of seeing everyone and everything and treating everyone and everything, then that existing trajectory we were on was part of the problem and would still be part of the problem, even if the IPCC turned around tomorrow and said, guys, really embarrassing, we did our sums wrong. Turns out you can throw out as much CO2 as you want, which obviously they're not going to do. But
you're saying, you're saying behind door number 2, this is happening on some level because there's a fundamental kind of twist or imbalance to how we relate to one another and our planet and consumption and happiness. And, we think, oh, I need to buy this thing, click Amazon and, have it shipped here in a container ship from China where people maybe don't get paid very well,
Yeah, it's deeper even than that. It's that we see the world as if the world is made of resources. Right. Resources are raw materials for industrial production. And
that we have an extractive relationship, you mean?
Yeah. And we see the world as a kind of dead mechanistic thing that's there for our purposes rather than a living thing that we're part of and involved in.
But I feel like most, at least elephant readers, would agree with you heartily, maybe agree with both, that, the chemistry is not working out for us, but also, door number 2 is much more deeply rooted and interesting. But how does door number 2 is there a path forward from that?
Well, so the next place that leads to, if that's the kind of looking back, the how did we get here, then it also leads you to this question of, so what is it that's ending? One of the lines in the Dark Mountain Manifesto that Paul and I wrote, nearly 15 years ago, that has kind of stuck around the most was where we said the end of the world as we know it is not the end of the world full stop. We have to be able to distinguish between those two things, because otherwise we will try and defend the world as we know it at all costs, as if that's possible or desirable. Part of what you're talking about when you say, well, what happens if I stand up and say it's too late? Once you say that, then we have to have a conversation about too late for what and what's left on the far side of that. Because a huge amount of the way that we've responded to the trouble that the world is in has been on the basis of a logic of sustainability, which whatever it starts out meaning, it ends up meaning sustaining the way of living of the Western middle classes at all costs.
But I think that's probably true for a lot of people. But I think, like, I really disagree actually with what Psycho Michelle said. And I say that respectfully, that the rock will always be here. Like George Carlin has a comic bit on that. I passionately disagree with that, because the earth is not a cold, hard rock. It is a living, magical, wonderful, wondrous ecosystem, countless ecosystems. And if we care about any species, let alone children or grandchildren, I'm not going to fight to keep the world exactly as it is. I think that's a weird attitude, but because the world's always evolving, but the world is so full of love and life. And, these birds, 50% of birds have died in the last, or is it 30% in the last 50 years? Insects are dying off. Like, I will fight to try to save those insects or birds and the overall ecosystem for sure.
Right. But the problem is, once sustainability means sustaining the ways of living of people who look like you and me,
sure,
then that's absolutely not what we end up fighting for. What we end up fighting for is our privileges.
Sure.
And part of what's at stake is if we want a chance of turning things around. I mean, what I always say when people ask me what's at stake, they say, is humanity going to be around at the end of the century? And I say, well, you and me, we're not going to be around by the end of the century. Let's be humble about this. Let's admit we don't know the end of the story. But I think what's at stake is that we've brought about one of the great bottlenecks in the history of this beautiful living earth. Not the first one. Like, the earth has been here before without our help. So we shouldn't take too much dark pride in the fact that humans are so central to the story of this great extinction. But nonetheless, what's at stake is how much comes through that bottleneck. And that's what you're talking about when you talk about the birds that you can hear outside your window as we're sitting having this conversation. Is like, what can I take responsibility for? Has a chance of being around when I'm gone, and where I have a chance of affecting whether or not that happens. And that's a totally different kind of question, a totally different kind of work to the project of, finding some way to keep a version of, early 21st to it going through the next handful of generations. Like, lots of stuff is going away. Let's make sure that the things that are at the top of the list of what is going away are some of the things that you and I were brought up to take for granted, rather than like trying to save those things at all costs, whilst what's going away is more and more of the insects and birds.
Yeah. I mean, I heartily agree generally with this thrust. I just think, we do have to take somewhat egotistical responsibility for a huge part in the destruction that has evolved over millennia of what's happening right now, and very rapidly. People talk about the sixth extinction, and I don't think that should give us pride. I think it should give us some sense of like, come to Jesus remorse, like let's change. And yeah, we should not only not defend the privileged way of life that we have taken for granted, as you say, but we want to stop spreading it, because honestly, as you know, with a lot of the world, they're more, Amazon is taking over, McDonald's is spreading, globalization is sort of like pushing the consumption, capitalism, all that stuff. And I'm not some like crazy socialist, but I do believe that, yeah, we can live with less. And I don't have a car, I bike. I try to And I enjoy doing all those things. All of those give me great joy. It's not out of some like liberal piety, but we do consume too much. So I guess I'm curious, like, at the end, if we can change our relationship with our world and know that we're going to lose a lot of what we grew up with, the magical, wonderful ecosystems. I mean, here in Boulder, as you probably read, 1,000 homes burned down a year ago in the dead of winter because it's so dry here and so hot. I mean, it's just changing.
Yeah, that's it. And even compared to 5 or 10 years ago, I find that I'm talking to more and more people who are experiencing it coming home to their places, to the places where they live or the places they love. It doesn't feel far away anymore, does it? And I think, that's part of what started to happen in the kind of climate movements began around 5 years ago, a year or two before the pandemic, was they had a very different flavor of them to that Al Gore era. It
Yeah.
wasn't anymore kind of the viewing tower a quarter of a mile from the edge of the abyss. Like you listen to Greta Thunberg or you listen to Gail Bradbrook from Extinction Rebellion, the power of these people's voices comes from you can hear their sleepless nights in the way they're speaking. You can see that these are human beings who are hanging out there over the abyss, and they're not going to make you any promise that says, if you do exactly what it was on this list, we can make it all okay. But they're saying we have to do something anyway. We have to act without some kind of childish guarantee that our action is going to make it all okay. It never was all okay.
Yeah.
That doesn't get you off the hook of looking for what is it that you can do, starting from where you find yourself. And your answer is going to be different to mine. It's going to be different to everybody who's listening to this. And part of that has to be, building the capacity for lives worth living on the far side of the abandonment of these promises of modernity, the promise that every generation was going to grow up with more stuff than its parents, which is kind of what we were all sold and what's still being sold, as you say, to lots of people elsewhere in the world. There's a book that really, really impacted me when I was writing this from a Brazilian educationalist, Vanessa Machado de Oliveira. She wrote this book called Hospicing Modernity. I just loved that title. It's like, what's at stake is not trying to save modernity. It's not trying to tear it down and have some revolutionary moment. Not trying to rush into what's coming next. It's trying to give it a good ending in the sense of limiting the damage in this ending that we're living through, and also allowing modernity to teach the lessons. You know how it is in times of endings, when people reach the end of life, there are often things they couldn't see before that come into view for them. So trying to let modernity teach us its last lessons as we try and help it have a good ending. And so Vanessa's like, we have to be hospicing modernity and assisting with the birth of something new, as yet unknown, possibly, but not necessarily wiser, and not smothering that new thing with our projections and our expectations, but letting it surprise us. So that feels like the two sides of this. The book's called The Work in the Ruins. So on the one hand, there's ruins. We're not going to avoid that. They're already here. They're around us. Frankly, they've been being created all over the rest of the world for 500 years. And we've been calling that progress. But now we're at the point where that's coming home to the places we live, places we love. And in that moment, we have to, on the one hand, recognize the ruins, but on the other hand, recognize that there is work to be done.
Well said. I think, in terms of like weaponized privilege, like the effect of modernity, as you said, has already been felt around the world. And, I always think of that scene. I mean, it happened in reality, but I think of the scene that in Gandhi, where entire nations are moving, with Pakistan, the advent of Pakistan. And, we're going to have mass migrations, and a lot of the pain that is going to happen is going to fall, of course, as usual, on those who are most vulnerable, those who are no longer have the glacier water, no longer have fishing, no longer have rising seas, whatever it is, drought, like the Dust Bowl in the 20s here in the US. So it's kind of painful that a lot of the costs will be paid by those with least who did the least to cause it. And I think
And,
that's where I just feel like, you
and
know,
it's even stranger than that, Waylon. There's a kind
yeah,
of paradox because that is all true and it's really important. And we often remind ourselves and remind each other of that. There's another part of the story that's almost more uncomfortable for you and me. And
yeah,
the person who brought this into view for me was the Indian novelist Amitav Ghosh. And he points out, he's like, part of what the governments of countries like India are betting on is that their people are already extraordinarily resilient. They're already used to living in the ruin. They're already used to things not working. And meanwhile, countries like the US, the UK, Sweden, like a very small amount of stuff going wrong is actually enough for things to grind to a halt because we're so used to systems that work and
yeah.
we're so lacking in the skills for improvising and finding ways to make things work when the infrastructure becomes unreliable. So
It's
that's another
like a national emergency here. If we have to pay like $1 more per gallon for some incredibly cheap gas, like gas that's cheaper than milk.
Yeah.
Like we are such babies, like, during the pandemic with the toilet paper, like it was a national emergency to hoard toilet paper here.
Yeah. And so
We're soft.
when I say that, I found myself questioning how far it made sense for me to go on starting the conversation from talking about climate change when I'm talking to people about the trouble the world is in.
Thanks for listening. Hope you're getting a lot out of it. The full conversation is on our indie platform that supports and continues our work, elephantjournal.com/videos. You can subscribe, listen, watch, and participate there. And when you do so, you'll keep these mindful videos and podcasts going. elephantjournal.com/videos. May it be of benefit.